She came to erase a past she never lived, but the river wouldn't let her forget. Samantha Blake had no plans to stop. Not for the rolling hills outside the car window. Not for the hollow barns or lonely mailboxes dotting the dirt road. She was here for one reason: to sell a forgotten piece of land and get back to the city before the weekend. But as the GPS blinked its final destination, Hawthorne Farm, her fingers tightened on the steering wheel. Something inside her stirred. Something ancient, something familiar. The farm was exactly what she expected, run down, silent, swallowed by ivy and time. But what she didn't expect were the two elderly women waiting by the porch. Violet and Nell. They looked like they had been carved from the land itself. Same pale eyes, same long silvery braids, same frozen stare. "Welcome home," said Violet. Her voice cracked like dry leaves. Samantha blinked. "Sorry, I think there's a mistake. I'm just here to sell what doesn't belong to you." Nell's voice was colder. That first moment and that tension in the air, it would never fully leave. As she crossed the creaky porch, the wind rustled through the trees like whispers. The river, she'd later find, ran behind the farm, hidden from view but not from memory. It hummed at night, low and steady, like it knew things, like it remembered things. The first night, Samantha couldn't sleep. The old wooden floors groaned beneath her steps. Somewhere in the dark, a clock ticked, though she hadn't seen one. Then came the whisper again, not from the wind, but from her own name, spoken softly, from the direction of the river. She got up. She walked out barefoot, through wet grass and into the night air thick with summer, down the sloping path to where the moonlight spilled silver on moving water. And then she saw it. A figure, no, a reflection that wasn't hers. A woman with her face, but older, sadder, standing just behind her. When she turned, no one was there. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just stood there, still, staring into the current, into the past. The river didn't forget, and now it wanted her to remember. Before the whispers and reflections, before the river and the strange sisters, Samantha Blake lived a life defined by order. A structured, controlled life in a high-rise apartment in Chicago's downtown loop. Her days were dictated by digital calendars, her emotions locked behind polite smiles and business jargon. At 38, she had built a reputation as a problem solver, a woman who never let messiness, emotional or otherwise, interfere with efficiency. Her mornings started at 6 a.m. sharp. Steel-cut oats, 1 cup of black coffee, a 30-minute jog with noise-cancelling earbuds. She didn't speak to neighbors. She didn't have plants. Too needy. She had cut ties with most of her family years ago, and not once had she looked back. But in the quiet moments, late at night, her fingers sometimes hovered over the photo tucked into the back of her drawer. A picture of her mother holding a baby, her, presumably. There were no dates, no names written on the back, just a river in the background, trees blurred by motion, and a feeling she could never quite shake. Her therapist called it unresolved grief. Samantha called it nonsense. She preferred spreadsheets to feelings, silence to conversation, contracts over conversations. Then came the letter. A simple envelope, no return address. Inside, a legal document stating that she had inherited a property in Weston County, a town she had never heard of. Attached was a handwritten note. "It's time you saw where you came from. V." Samantha thought about trashing it. She didn't need anyone's land, especially not some farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. But something about that initial V, it scratched at her like an itch under the skin. She told herself it was just curiosity. A quick trip, sign some papers, sell the land, get out, easy. But a subtle anxiety began to settle in her chest as she packed for the trip. A restlessness she hadn't felt in years, as if her body knew something she didn't. as if some thread from her past had started tugging, pulling her back into a place she never chose to remember. On the drive, she tried to ignore the landscape, the open fields, the soft hills, the heavy silence of rural life. But it was hard not to notice how everything felt. Slowed down, like time had forgotten this place, or had chosen to preserve it just long enough for her to return. She didn't tell anyone where she was going, not her assistant, not her few distant friends, not even her therapist. This trip, for the first time in a long time, wasn't about results. It was about questions. And something deep inside her, a voice she'd spent decades ignoring, whispered, "You won't leave with the same life you brought here." The farmhouse creaked under the weight of silence. Samantha had planned to stay one night, maybe two, but each morning brought something unexpected. A locked drawer mysteriously opened, a diary placed on her bed, and always the river's presence, just beyond the trees, calling in whispers only she seemed to hear. Violet and Nell were polite, but distant. They spoke in riddles, paused too long before answering questions, and often exchanged glances when Samantha mentioned her mother. At breakfast, Nell once said, "Your eyes, just like hers." Samantha asked who she meant. The old woman didn't reply. 3 days in, while exploring the attic, Samantha found a wooden chest beneath a moth-eaten quilt. Inside, photographs of her mother as a teenager, on that very farm. One showed her, pregnant, standing at the edge of the river. The back read, "Spring 1987, right before she ran." Samantha's heart pounded. Her mother never mentioned growing up in the countryside. She had always spoken of Detroit, of working 3 jobs, of running from nowhere, not toward it. Later that evening, she confronted Violet. "Why are there pictures of my mother here? Why didn't she ever tell me about this place?" Violet looked at her without blinking. "Because she was protecting you." "From what?" Samantha asked. But Nell interrupted, calmly placing a cup of tea in front of her. "From the truth, the kind that sinks roots into your bones." That night, unable to sleep again, Samantha wandered toward the river, barefoot on the cold grass. The moon hung low, heavy and golden. The water shimmered unnaturally as if alive, and then she saw it, a small wooden cradle, half submerged by the bank. She rushed to it, confused, horrified. It was empty, but wrapped in a decaying blue cloth. Inside was a small rusted locket. She pried it open. 2 tiny portraits, her mother and an infant that wasn't her. Or was it? A splash behind her. She spun around, no one there, but she could feel it, that she wasn't alone. When she returned to the house, her hands muddy and shaking, Violet and Nell were waiting on the porch. They didn't look surprised. "You found it," Violet whispered, "just like she did." "I need answers," Samantha demanded. Nell sighed. "Then you'd better sit down, because once we tell you, you won't be able to forget. Not like she tried to, not like we did." The world around her slowed. The wind stilled. And everything, the locket, the river, the sisters, pointed to a secret she'd never imagined. She wasn't the only child her mother left behind, and she might not have been the first. The days that followed moved like molasses. Samantha stayed, not because she wanted to, but because she couldn't seem to leave. Something held her there, quiet and invisible, like a thread pulling at her soul. Every time she packed her suitcase, something small would stop her. A look from Violet. A photo slipped under her door. The sound of a child laughing near the river, though no children lived nearby. She stopped returning calls, stopped answering emails. Her phone battery died, and she didn't bother to recharge it. At breakfast, Nell poured her coffee and asked about her dreams. Samantha hadn't mentioned the dreams, not to anyone. "They come when the river begins to remember," Violet said one morning, not looking up from her knitting. That's how it starts. The dreams were vivid, disjointed, flashes of someone else's life. A girl running barefoot through the woods, a woman screaming in a thunderstorm, the sound of an infant wailing, then, abruptly, silence. Samantha began to feel unmoored. Her sense of time slipped. She would lose track of hours. Sometimes she'd find herself standing at the edge of the river without remembering walking there. Once, she woke in the attic, curled beside the old chest, her hands clutching that locket in her sleep. In her waking hours, the silence of the farm grew heavy. Violet and Nell became more withdrawn. The more questions Samantha asked, the more they stared at her with pity, not as someone seeking truth, but as someone already entangled in it. One evening, as rain tapped gently on the windows, Violet finally told her the story. "There was a baby before you," she said. "Your mother gave birth here. In this house, she was just a girl herself." Samantha sat frozen. She named him Eli, but he didn't survive the winter. The world tilted. "She buried him down by the river," Nell added. "But she didn't tell anyone. Not at first. Not until she was gone." Samantha's chest tightened. Why would she hide that from me? "She couldn't bear to look at you," Violet said softly, "because you looked just like him." It explained everything. The coldness, the distance, the sadness her mother never voiced. Samantha had always thought she simply wasn't enough, that she was hard to love, but now she saw she had been a reminder, a wound her mother never let heal. After that night, Samantha stopped trying to sleep. She spent hours by the river, tracing the soil with her fingertips. She didn't cry. The tears wouldn't come. Instead, she listened to the wind, to the current, to the sound of memory. Something inside her had cracked open, not shattered, but split, wide and raw. And in that opening, the pain settled, like sediment in the river, a quiet grief, a silent reckoning. She now knew the truth, and nothing about her life could go back to how it was before. For days, Samantha lived in that numb space between knowledge and action. The truth had lodged itself deep, and though it no longer shocked her, it sat heavy, a stone at the base of her ribs. Then came the morning of the first frost. She woke early. The windows were glazed with white. The fields shimmered like powdered glass. The river was quiet, sluggish, as if it too felt the weight of winter approaching. And something about the silence that day was different, not hollow, but expectant, like the land was holding its breath. Samantha stood on the porch, wrapped in her mother's old shawl, one of the many items Violet had quietly laid out for her piece by piece over the weeks. A sweater here, a book there, a slow restoration of a past she'd never touched with her own hands. She stared out over the land, not as an outsider anymore, but as someone whose blood had long soaked into the soil. That's when the thought came. What if she stayed? Not forever, not entirely, but long enough to listen, long enough to stop running. She had always prided herself on moving forward, efficiency, detachment, but forward wasn't always the same as healing, and she was tired of avoiding what hurt. Later that day, she followed the path down to the river. Frost crunched underfoot. The trees stood bare, skeletal and honest. She knelt by the patch of earth where her mother had buried Eli. A small wooden marker now stood there, freshly carved. She hadn't asked who had done it. She placed the locket on the ground beside it, quietly, gently, a gesture of recognition, of the boy who had come before her, the brother she never met, the grief she had inherited without knowing. Her breath formed clouds in the cold air, and then she spoke aloud, not a eulogy, not a prayer, but a simple truth. "I forgive you." The words didn't feel light. They didn't erase what had been lost, but they rooted something inside her, a sense of direction, not away from pain, but toward something deeper, understanding. That night, she sat with Violet and Nell by the fire. They didn't talk about the past. They talked about blackberry jam and the time the cows escaped into town and the year the river froze solid. Samantha laughed, really laughed, for the first time in years. And in that laughter, something cracked again. But this time, it wasn't pain breaking through. It was warmth. Later, as she fell asleep under a quilt older than she was, she realized the fear had lifted. Not gone, but no longer steering her. She had made a choice. She would not sell the farm. She would stay. For a while. For as long as the river remembered. The seasons changed, and with them, so did Samantha. What was meant to be a weekend stay stretched into months, then quietly into years. She never made a formal decision to remain. She simply never found a good enough reason to leave. The farm, once foreign and lifeless in her eyes, began to breathe again. With her hands, she mended broken fences. With her feet, she traced the old walking paths her mother used to wander. And with her heart, still cautious, still healing, she opened herself to the rhythm of a life without deadlines. In spring, she planted a garden. It was awkward at first. Her city hands blistered. The soil didn't bend easily. But Violet taught her the way her mother had once learned, kneeling in the dirt, pressing seeds like secrets into the earth. By summer, tomatoes bloomed. Sunflowers stretched. Bees danced. She smiled more, laughed with the old women as if she'd known them forever. There was an evening in July when they all sat on the porch watching fireflies, and Nell leaned over and whispered, "Your mother used to chase them too." Samantha didn't cry. She just nodded. Because now, memories didn't sting. They shimmered, like those lights in the dark. Time passed quietly, measured not in clocks, but in rituals. First frost, first bloom, first blackberry pie. The farmhouse walls echoed with new life. Not noise, just presence. She began writing letters, long, winding thoughts, not to anyone specific. Sometimes to Eli, sometimes to her younger self. She kept them in a wooden box beside her bed. She no longer needed answers, only space for what had never been spoken. On the second autumn, Violet passed away. It was peaceful, a slow exhale during an afternoon nap. The grief was gentle, different than the old sharp kind. It felt like the turning of a page. Nell remained, frail but steady. She and Samantha now walked together in the mornings, always ending their strolls by the river, where the leaves now fell like golden feathers on the current. One afternoon, as they stood in silence by Eli's grave, Nell took Samantha's hand and said softly, "Your mother loved this place, but it scared her too. She didn't know how to carry both things at once." Samantha squeezed her hand. "I think I do now." Years moved like wind across the fields, visible only through what they left behind. A deeper wrinkle, a fuller pantry, a name carved beside Eli's, Margaret Blake, mother, remembered. Visitors began to come, curious townsfolk, distant cousins. A teacher from the local school invited Samantha to speak about the farm's history. She said yes, not because she needed to tell her story, but because she had one now, and it no longer hurt to share it. It was late October, the kind of crisp afternoon where the air carries both nostalgia and warning. The river had turned silver again, restless and fast, mirroring the tension that had begun to build inside Samantha without explanation. Then came the letter. It wasn't postmarked, no envelope, just a folded sheet, slipped under the door like a whisper in ink. 4 words, written in delicate, almost fragile handwriting. "You were not alone." Samantha froze. For a long time she stared at the note. She had come to accept that her mother had buried one child, Eli, that he was her older brother, that the grief of his loss had shaped their family's silence. But this suggested more. She took the letter to Nell, who read it with trembling hands and then set it down, her face unreadable. There were rumors, she admitted slowly. That your mother wasn't alone when she gave birth. That someone helped her. A man who lived by the woods. He was never seen again. Samantha leaned forward. You think she had help? Nell shook her head. No, I think she had a witness. And I think he may have taken something with him when he left. A storm rolled in that night, sudden and sharp. Thunder cracked the sky as Samantha paced the hallway. Then, through the window, she saw something. A figure, tall, cloaked, walking along the edge of the riverbank with a lantern. Without hesitation, she grabbed her coat and followed. She walked fast, the wind lashing her hair, boots sinking into soft earth. The figure ahead moved with purpose, never looking back. Finally, at the old wooden bridge near the back edge of the property, he stopped. Samantha approached, heart racing. Who are you? He turned. He was in his 60s, maybe older, his face worn, eyes sharp. He looked at her for a long time before speaking. You look just like her. Her blood chilled. He introduced himself as Harlan, a former farmhand. Said he knew her mother. Said he was there the night Eli was born, and the night another child was taken. Samantha's voice broke. Taken? He nodded. Twins. She had twins. The storm howled above them, but everything else went silent. She couldn't handle two. Not after what happened to the father. I took one to a church across the county line, gave him up before she woke. She never knew. I thought I was saving you both. Samantha staggered back. You're telling me I have a brother, alive? Harlan reached into his coat and handed her a photo. A young man, same jawline, same eyes, a name scribbled on the back, Caleb. Then he turned and disappeared into the woods, like a ghost exhaled by the past. Samantha stood on the bridge, soaked and shaking, photo clenched in her fist. Her whole world had shifted again. She wasn't just her mother's only daughter. She was someone's sister. Winter came early that year. The snow fell softly over the fields, covering the earth like a memory retold, delicate, incomplete, but no longer buried. The farmhouse stood quiet, but not silent, filled now with a new kind of presence. Not ghosts, not shadows, but truths finally allowed to breathe. Samantha spent her mornings by the fire, the photo of Caleb never far from reach. She hadn't contacted him yet, not because she was afraid, but because she wanted to do it right. After everything she had learned, she no longer rushed into anything, especially not family. Instead, she wrote, letters to him she never mailed, letters to her mother, to Violet, to Eli, letters to the girl she used to be, the one who thought she had to earn love by building empires and hiding her grief behind deadlines. What surprised her most was the peace, not in having answers, but in learning to live with the questions. She had once believed identity came from achievement, a corner office, a name on the door, a city skyline out the window. But the farmhouse taught her something different. That who you are is not only made from what you build, but from what you're willing to uncover, to carry, to forgive. That love is not always loud. Sometimes it grows in silence. In the daily, repetitive acts of care, folding an old quilt, planting tulip bulbs, reading aloud to someone who might forget by morning. And grief, it doesn't vanish. It settles. It weaves itself into the stories we choose to tell and the ones we choose to rewrite. Samantha eventually traveled to a small town 2 hours away, to the church where Harlan said he left the baby. She walked its narrow halls, read the old records, and there it was, Caleb Waters. Born October 9th, 1987, no parents listed. She didn't cry. Instead, she smiled, a strange, full, aching smile. He had a name. He had lived. She hadn't been alone after all. Back on the farm, spring began to wake the land again. The river ran faster. Wildflowers broke through the frost-bitten soil. Life has always continued, messy, unfinished, and somehow beautiful. Samantha stood on the porch one morning, tea in hand, watching the mist lift from the fields. She thought about everything that had brought her here. The silence, the secrets, the sisters, the storm. And she knew now, her mother hadn't just left behind pain. She had left behind a path. One that Samantha was finally strong enough to walk. Some stories don't end with answers. They end with possibility. And maybe that's enough. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like and share it with your friends. What would you do if you discovered a secret that changed everything you knew about yourself? Comment below and let me know your thoughts. I'd love to hear your perspective. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you won't miss more stories like this. Join me next time for another deep dive into life's hidden truths.